This is Psychological Exit Ramps, Episode 3, where people quietly reclaim their thinking. There's a moment that happens in certain environments where something strange begins to occur. You start asking simple questions, not difficult questions, just basic ones. Questions that should have clear answers, but instead of clarity, you receive explanations that somehow make the situation feel even more complicated. The answers seem long, detailed, sometimes even impressive. But when the conversation ends, you realize something odd. You're not any closer to understanding what's going on. In fact, you may feel even more confused than when you started. So you ask another question, and once again the response arrives: more language, more explanation, more complexity, but still no clarity. Over time, something subtle begins happening inside your thinking. You start assuming the problem might be you. Maybe you're missing something. Maybe the situation is more complicated than you realize. Maybe the people explaining it simply understand things at a deeper level. But every once in a while, someone pauses long enough to notice a pattern. The confusion never actually resolves. It just continues. And that realization can be the beginning of something very important, because confusion is not always accidental. Sometimes confusion is part of the system itself. Confusion becomes powerful when it shifts responsibility away from the system and onto the person experiencing it. If a situation is unclear, most people naturally assume they simply need more information, more details, more context, more explanation. So they keep asking questions. And every time they ask, they receive more material to process, more terminology, more frameworks, more explanations layered on top of explanations. At first, this can feel like progress because it appears that people are trying to help you understand. But if you look closely at certain systems, something interesting begins to appear. The explanations never quite resolve the core question. Instead, they expand the complexity around it. And as complexity increases, something subtle happens to the person trying to understand. They begin doubting their own perception. They begin assuming that clarity must exist somewhere just beyond their level of comprehension. So they keep trying to catch up, they keep studying, they keep listening, they keep deferring to the people who seem more confident about the situation. Over time, the psychological effect of this pattern can become very powerful, because once someone assumes that their confusion is a personal limitation, they stop examining the structure that produced the confusion in the first place. The system becomes unquestionable. The authority of the explanation becomes unquestionable. And the person inside the system becomes increasingly dependent on the people who claim to understand it. This dynamic appears in many places: in organizations, in institutions, in complex bureaucracies, in ideological movements, even in personal relationships. Confusion can become a stabilizing force, because people who feel confused tend to defer to whoever appears most certain, and that deference quietly consolidates influence. The trap isn't simply misunderstanding. The trap is believing that confusion must always be solved by listening to the same system that produced it. Once that belief takes hold, people can remain inside confusing environments for years, trying to reach a level of understanding that never quite arrives. But occasionally, someone pauses long enough to ask a different question. Not, what am I missing? But, why does this remain confusing? And that question can lead to a very different kind of realization. The realization usually begins with a very simple observation. You notice that the confusion never actually resolves, no matter how many explanations appear. The clarity you were expecting never quite arrives. At first, you assume the problem must be complexity. Some subjects are genuinely complicated. Organizations can be large. Systems can involve many moving parts, but eventually something begins to stand out. Even the simplest questions seem to generate long explanations. Instead of clear answers, you receive language that circles around the issue, and the response sounds sophisticated, but it doesn't actually reduce the confusion. In fact, the more the situation is explained, the harder it becomes to identify the original question. This is the moment when a person sometimes pauses and looks at the pattern itself. They stop focusing on the content of the explanation and begin observing the structure of the interaction. They notice that every time clarity seems close, another layer of explanation appears. More terminology, more distinctions, more frameworks, and slowly a new possibility begins to emerge. What if the confusion itself is not accidental? What if the confusion is performing a function? Because confusion has a very predictable psychological effect. When people feel confused, they tend to defer to whoever appears most certain. The person who speaks confidently becomes the guide. The one who seems to understand the complexity becomes the authority. And once that dynamic forms, the confused participants often stop evaluating the system itself. They assume the authority must be legitimate, simply because the situation appears difficult to understand. But once someone notices this pattern, the experience of confusion begins to change. Instead of feeling like a personal failure, it begins to look more like a signal that something in the structure may not be operating transparently. The person observing the system begins asking a different kind of question. Not, what information am I missing? But what would this situation look like if it were actually clear? Sometimes the answer is surprisingly simple. If a process were transparent, its basic structure could be explained in a few sentences. If a decision made sense, the reasoning behind it could be described plainly. If the system were functioning openly, basic questions wouldn't trigger complicated detours. And once a person recognizes this difference, the fog begins to lift. They realize that clarity and complexity are not the same thing. Some things in life are genuinely complex, but genuine complexity still allows for explanations of the fundamentals. Artificial complexity, on the other hand, tends to obscure the fundamentals. It replaces clarity with layers. It replaces understanding with terminology. It replaces transparency with interpretation. Once someone sees that pattern, something very important changes. They stop assuming that confusion means they need more explanation. Instead, they begin examining the structure that produced the confusion in the first place. And that shift marks the beginning of another exit ramp. Once someone recognizes that confusion itself may be part of the structure, the instinct is often to push harder for answers, to demand clarity, to challenge the explanations more directly. But systems built around confusion tend to absorb that pressure very easily. They respond with more explanation, more language, more technical detail, which often pulls the conversation deeper into the same cycle. The real exit ramp begins with a subtle shift. Instead of trying to defeat the confusion inside the system, the observer steps back and changes how they evaluate the situation. They begin asking a much simpler question. What would clarity look like here? Not perfect knowledge, not complete information, just a clear understanding of the basic structure. If a process makes sense, its core logic should be explainable in simple terms. If a decision is legitimate, the reason behind it should be understandable without layers of interpretation. When someone starts looking for that level of clarity, something interesting happens. Many explanations that once sounded impressive begin to look very different. They begin noticing how complexity is used in place of transparency. They notice when explanations circle around the issue instead of addressing it directly. They notice when language becomes more elaborate, precisely at the moment when clarity should be emerging. At that point, the confusion loses much of its psychological grip, because confusion only works when a person assumes that more explanation will eventually resolve it. Once that assumption disappears, the observer stops chasing the next layer of explanation. Instead, they watch the structure itself. They watch how the system responds to simple questions. They watch how certain topics produce immediate complexity. They watch how authority is established through confidence rather than clarity. And over time, the situation becomes much easier to see. The observer no longer feels obligated to fully decode the system in order to understand what is happening. Sometimes recognizing the pattern itself is enough. You see that the environment is built around maintaining interpretation rather than providing transparency. And once that becomes visible, something subtle shifts. You stop assuming that confusion belongs to you. You begin recognizing that the confusion may belong to the structure itself. That recognition alone often restores a surprising amount of mental clarity, because the pressure to figure it all out quietly disappears. And instead of feeling lost inside the system, you begin seeing the system from the outside. Learning to recognize these patterns is something I explore more deeply in my book, Psychological Exit Ramps, where I examine the psychological dynamics that keep people inside confusing environments, and the moments when they begin stepping outside those patterns. But the key insight is simple. Clarity doesn't always come from finding better explanations. Sometimes it comes from noticing when explanation itself has become part of the mechanism. Confusion has an unusual effect on the human mind. When people feel confused, they often assume the problem must be inside themselves. They assume they simply haven't studied enough, or listened carefully enough, or reach the level of understanding that others seem to have. But occasionally, someone pauses long enough to ask a different question. Not whether they understand the system, but whether the system is designed to be understood at all. And that question changes the experience of confusion completely. Because when confusion is no longer interpreted as a personal failure, it stops carrying the same emotional weight. It becomes information. Information about how the environment operates. And once confusion becomes information rather than identity, excuse me, something important happens. The pressure begins to fade and clarity returns. And what once looked like an unsolvable puzzle begins to look like something much simpler, a structure that was easier to see than it first appeared. That moment, when confusion turns into understanding, is the beginning of another exit ramp. If this idea resonates with you, the next episode explores another psychological exit ramp people discover when they start seeing clearly. Sometimes the most powerful step forward is simply stepping off the road.